Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I think sort of walking into a very high tech place with all of you is a bit intimidating, but hopefully I'll have some information to provide in terms of what at least state government is doing in the area of New York State government is doing in the area of cybersecurity protection, which, as all of you in here know, or hopefully believe, is the number one threat that we face in this country and the world, in my view, and certainly our industries are threatened by it, our personal privacy is threatened by it, and our very democracy in this country is threatened by it. And I don't think there's any really walk of life today that is protected from cybersecurity, hackers and criminals, and those who are seeking to do harm. So again, I don't think I have to preach to this group. I can tell you that there are a lot of groups that I go to that I feel like I do have to preach on the issue of cybersecurity. So it's great to be here with you. And in fact, I've been sounding the alarm on this issue since I took the job in February of 2016 as the superintendent of the New York State Department of Financial Services. And the question that I keep asking is, people like me and lots of others, and I'm sure many of you in here, have been sounding the alarm for some time. The question is, are enough people listening? So usually when I give speeches, and I give speeches a lot, I like to do a little bit of research. And I've been speaking a lot about cybersecurity, and I always try to find something slightly different. Very recently, I came across a New York Times article that was written by a financial writer on the staff of the paper. The author described a phenomenon apparently common among those who report on the happenings at financial institutions, and I regulate New York's financial industry, so this piece is of particular note to me. And this phenomenon that the author was describing was called BOB, B-O-B, and it stands for Board of Banks. So I regulate banks in New York, so I paid attention to it. And the reason that this phenomenon happens of BOB, or Board of Banks, is that the big federally regulated banks have been doing so many complicated, frightening, and frighteningly complicated things so much of the time that readership gets numb to all of that information. They can't absorb it, they can't understand it, so they just tune it out. And they keep seeing it, and they tune it out. So when there's even a steady drumbeat warning of destruction, the likes of which we haven't seen since the financial crisis, which was in 2008, and there was a lot of that, and there was a lot of this Board of Banks, or whether the music plays for some other, as yet unfamiliar crisis that's just beginning to percolate. So both the writers and the readers start getting this BOB phenomenon, where they get bored of the subject and they tune it out. So what if that were to be transferable to the next virus or the next percolating crisis, and it mutates from Board of Banks to Board of Cybercrime, BOC, B-O-C-C. Not as catchy as Bob, and doesn't have a sort of a figure perhaps behind it, but I worry about that. There's so much frequency, there's so much severity, and there's so much variety of cyber attacks that I've even seen just in less than 2 months on the job that I have now. It's alarming. There's threats to our identity, there's threats to our financial industries, there's threats to our democracy. Today it's Russia, where is it going to be tomorrow? We've seen North Korea. We can't hide from it, and we see it in its own country. We've seen it in the past couple of weeks. I used to try to think of long words and many words to describe it. Now there's only one word, Equifax, right? And that's 145 million people, but who's counting? So just a little background. So as the superintendent of the New York State Department of Financial Services, I actually regulate New York's financial services industry. That's banking, that's insurance, financial products and services, chartered, licensed in the state of New York. And since, of course, New York is the financial capital of the world, that's a lot of industry. That's trillions of dollars of of Commerce. And so that's why cybersecurity is something that should be, and certainly in my mind has been, at the forefront of the work that we're doing at my agency, which is also known as DFS. Everybody has to have an acronym. You have several of them here. ISA, ISACA. I have DFS. Not as easy, 3 syllables. But I actually have been warning about this since I took the job, and 6 months into the job, I actually proposed a cybersecurity regulation for the financial industries in New York. And then we went through 2 comment periods. That's sort of the legal process that we have to go through as a regulator, where you take in comments, and we got a lot of, stacks and stacks of paper, lots of meetings, and we got a lot of very good comments, actually. There were some people that said that, we didn't go far enough. There were some people that said that, we shouldn't do anything at all, and I think we got it just right. And I finalized our cybersecurity regulation in March of this year. And I can tell you that there were many skeptics, and there still are many skeptics. They're skeptical that somehow this age of risk of cybersecurity is not upon us. But most of all, people question, why is regulation the answer? And in my mind, it's not the answer, but it is certainly one answer to ensure that industry does what it's supposed to do, that it has systems in place to protect against cyber attacks as much as possible. We know that criminals are ahead of the game. We know that they can get there anyway. But unless regulation or laws of some sort are out there, it is certainly possible that well-meaning people will do it, but a lot of people won't. And so, in my view, to question the regulator's role, go look to Washington, D.C., not here in New York, because in New York, we will do things to protect the people and to protect industry itself. When I'm asked what keeps me up at night, and people do ask me that, my answer is always the same: cybersecurity. And so, why not act? So, rather than talk about the threat in a general sense, I thought I would tell all of you, who are obviously professionals in the field, a little bit more about what we have done at DFS with our cybersecurity regulation. As I said, it went into effect on March 1st of this year. And we have several different compliance dates. The first one was a 6-month date, and then we have a year annual, we have an 18-month, and we have a 2-year, because we recognize that for institutions that didn't have programs in place, it would take them time for various aspects of what we're requiring in our cybersecurity regulation. The first compliance date has passed, August 28th of this year. And it's important for everyone here, I hope, to get the word out about the regulation so that others follow suit. And what is it that we are requiring? We are requiring that institutions perform annual risk assessments. It's pretty simple. Figure out your institution and the risks that you face, and do a risk assessment on an annual basis. Then have a program in place, not only written policies, but have programs in place that have adequate controls to address those risks that your institution has. And there's a lot more to it, which I'll get to, but that's essentially what our cybersecurity regulation does. Before I get into those details, I thought for this group, maybe a little bit more about why DFS is so focused on this, not just because we regulate the financial services industry, but also because of our mission statement. So my agency was formed in 2011, so it's been in existence for a little over 6 years. It was formed by the merger of the former Department of Banking and the former Department of Insurance. And those were in existence for over a century each. But it was brought together under the New York State Financial Services law in direct response to the 2008 financial crisis, where there are obviously gaps in regulation, and there's obviously an overlap in insurance companies and banks and financial services providers generally. And the financial services law, which is the enabling legislation, which I obviously have to pay attention to, sets out what my mission, the mission of my agency is. And it says as follows: to reform the regulation of financial services in New York, to keep pace with the rapid and dynamic evolution of these industries, to guard against financial crises, and to protect consumers and markets from fraud. So if that doesn't keep me up at night, I don't know what does. But to reform the regulation, to keep pace with rapid and dynamic evolution of the industries, guard against crises, and protect consumers and markets from fraud. It's a broad mission by design. And what it does is it allows the agency not just to sort of look at the here and now, not only to be I'm a law enforcement agency as well, not only to look at past conduct and figure out what an appropriate punishment might be, but to actually look broadly at the financial services industry, try to keep pace with that industry, and to guard against bad things happening in the future. And that's really what I think the regulator role, certainly my role, is in large part. Not to say that law enforcement is not an important thing, but I say this very, very often. If you're only looking at punishing behavior in the past, you're not doing a fulsome enough job, because prevention of bad things that might happen is critical. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at that, and it's why cybersecurity is so important. It's something where the industry, everybody should really be on the same page. It shouldn't be a competitive issue. It shouldn't be, we should all be on the same page to prevent things from happening. Frankly, I don't want to see, major breaches and then have to say, okay, now we're going to have some law enforcement action to go after the people responsible. I mean, if we have to do that, we will, of course. But you don't want to see that happening in the first. So when I arrived, certainly at the agency, there were a lot of high-profile breaches. This was before the election. This was before Russia, although, frankly, I was talking about Russia and all of that before the election, but because there was lots of other information about that before. But we had Yahoo, and I had to change my notes, because something happened this week. But, back when I arrived, there had been 2 reported massive breaches, one affecting 500 million people, another one affecting 1 billion people. And now this week they say everybody was affected by this breach, and it's 3 billion people. So if you ever had it, don't call them up, don't go on the email, you've all been breached. If you ever used Yahoo, you've all been breached. I say the same thing about Equifax. Don't call them up, don't send your social security number to them, assume you've been breached. And then figure out what actions to take as a result of that. So, with the Yahoo breach, it was name, emails, telephone numbers, security questions and answers, dates of birth, hashed passwords, all stolen. So that was major league in the news when I arrived at the agency, as was the Anthem breach. Anybody remember that? They had a second one. And that was millions and millions of people whose personal health records were breached by a cyber attack. I mean, think about identity theft, but think about them knowing about health. Think about the potential for extortion if any of those people are members of government or anywhere else. I mean, there's just so much that sort of a bad actor could use from that. So all of this was clearly in the news, everybody, and there were lots of meetings. I showed up on the job, lots of meetings. Went to Washington, met with various agencies. We had meetings all over the place. And I said, you know what, everybody's talking about this. It's great to talk about it, and it's great to raise awareness. It's critically important, but you got to do something about it. And so that's why we did the cybersecurity regulation. And for those of us, and I certainly put myself in this, that believe that government has a role, other people have a role too, but certainly government has a role to do something about it. So the point, as I've mentioned, of our cybersecurity regulation was to recognize and really be very clear and tell all the institutions that are regulated by the agency that we live in an increasingly global and interconnected world, no kidding, that has lots of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So our financial system is at great risk of threats, foreign and domestic, internal and external. The internal threats are probably of larger number than the external one because people make stupid mistakes. But you still have to have programs that make sure that a lot of people don't have all of the data so that those stupid mistakes can happen. Democratic National Committee was hacked. I'm not making a political statement. It was hacked because of an internal person, clicking on a link. Crazy. Are we going to prevent all those things? Probably not, but do we need to sort of do more about it? Yes. And it's critical that our financial institutions stay ahead of this. And at DFS, my agency, I have health insurance, huge, life insurance, property casualty. That includes auto insurance. Everybody in the state of New York has auto insurance. You have to. It's law, right? So there's a lot of data there. And of course, on the banking side, there's people that, there's money. That could filter out. And there have been numerous attacks on the financial services industry. In 2015, this is actual data, there were over 700 data breaches. 3 of the top 10 of those were from the healthcare industry. I mentioned Anthem, that was one. But 3 of the top 10 was healthcare. The Anthem one was 78.8 million patient records, and an additional 10 plus million non-patient records were compromised. And that's on one side of my house. On the other side was the banks. In 2016, it was widely reported that suspected Chinese hackers stole almost $100 million from the accounts of Bangladesh Bank here at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So the money is at the Federal Reserve, and there was a hacker, and not all of it went out. They caught it before more went out, but that was a major, impact. There's also been information, this is public information, that North Korea may have also had a role in that attack, and most of the money was not recovered. It also was reported in 2016 that hackers had stolen more than 2 billion rubles from correspondent banks at the Russian Central Bank. So there was that as well in the banking industry. Just this May, there was a massive ransomware hack that hit countries across the globe. The hackers were keeping up with technology. They deployed it with malice. And the effects of that hack would have been considerably worse were it not for a very young expert who uncovered and publicized a kill switch. I don't know if you remember this, that halted the spread of that malware, which was incredible. He was an alert, trained, and thankfully he was not bored. He didn't follow the Bach or the Bob, to our great benefit. So, interestingly, when that ransomware hack happened in May, I wanted to make sure that the cybersecurity regulation that we had finalized in March actually would have addressed it. And lo and behold, yes, it would, and did, for those covered by the reg. We have a section of our reg that's about penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. You all know what that means. And our reg requires that the cybersecurity program that the entity have must include monitoring and testing that is designed to assess the effectiveness of the covered entity's cybersecurity program, and shall's an important word, it means you have to do it, shall include continuous monitoring or periodic penetration testing, pen testing, you all know, and vulnerability assessments, including any systematic scans or reviews of information systems reasonably designed to identify publicly known cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the covered entity's information systems based on the risk assessment. These are biannual scans that our regulation requires. And those biannual scans, for those who would have employed them, and we didn't have any institutions affected, thankfully, by that ransomware, but it would have identified the vulnerability had the DFS regulation applied to the institutions that were actually affected by it. Now, of course, you could have scans that I guess don't work. That's what Equifax says. That, they was aware of this Apache virus and they didn't address it. This is all based on public information. They didn't address it, and then the actual hackers apparently were there between May and July. At least that's what they're saying. And as you all know, ransomware hackers, continue to exploit weaknesses in even retired software. There was once, a highly popular Windows XP. Funny, because we're here at Microsoft. Microsoft released the patch late in the life of the hack in order to arrest the spread of that. And again, for something like that, our cybersecurity regulation would address that problem because it required the retiring of the software. Pretty simple, the regulation says that, which is a process that you all know is known as patch management, of acquiring, testing, and installing multiple patches or code changes to an administered computer system. So as I said, our cybersecurity regulation, the first 180-day requirement has passed. So all of our institutions as of August 28th of this year were required and should now have a cybersecurity program designed to protect customers' private data, a written policy or policies that are approved by the board of directors or a senior officer. Why is that? Because they have the purse strings. Don't stick it on the compliance officer. It's got to go to the people that have the purse strings. Our reg requires that there be a chief information security officer that helps protect the data and the systems. And on an annual basis, the CISO has to do a written report to the board of directors. And the program has to have controls and plans in place to ensure the safety and soundness of the company. I also have a notice requirement. And you hear, so Equifax, okay, they were talking about it, they found out about it back end of July. They didn't report it till early September. That's not good enough. We require 72 hours notice from a determination that there's been an event. Obviously, there may be things you're not aware of, so you can't provide notice if you're not aware of it. But if you're aware of it, you have to provide notice to the department, to the government on that. Future requirements, because as I said, we have a 6-month, we have a year, we have an 18-month, and we have a 2-year, are things such as provisions regarding third-party vendors, probably one of the most significant issues to address. You can't get around your obligation on cybersecurity by exporting your data to some cheapo vendor that's going to do the work. If you're going to do that, then you have to make sure that that vendor has adequate protections because you're going to be responsible. That's what our reg says. It's pretty simple. As I mentioned, the CISO has to do an annual report to the board of directors. I mentioned also pen testing, encryption, vulnerability assessments. The other thing that we talk about, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is multi-factor authentication, which has become even more important now, and I wonder whether two-factor is enough today. It's an interesting discussion to sort of think about how much we should require and how much we should use biometrics, because I think we all know Social Security numbers right now have all been pretty much breached. What do we do about this situation? And we'll continue to think about it. The other thing that our reg requires is training. You have to train your people on cybersecurity awareness. That's how maybe you can address some of the internal issues, but also just generally. We also require a certificate of compliance on an annual basis. So come February 15th, every institution has to submit a certificate of compliance, which is the board of directors by resolution or a senior official has to sign it and say that they're in compliance with the regulation. Again, why is that? Because you make somebody senior sign it, you're more likely to actually have compliance because they'll make sure the work gets done. So I would say that, it's just a fact that we've been out of the gate first on this. We're the first state in the nation. The federal government doesn't have any regulation. They have lots of standards and guidance, and the federal agencies are not coordinated on that, certainly with respect to the financial services industry. I'm not talking about national security generally. That's not, my area, but in terms of the financial services industry, I'm not at all looking for sort of admiration or anything because we were out there first or because we're right. And in fact, I say this all the time, mimicry is the most sincere form of flattery. So don't just say, okay, that's great that you do that. Why don't you just copy it and do it too? And then we can all work together for consistency and to ensure that we're all protected. Because I think that that's the way New York can lead best and export it. So what I'm doing in that area, so as I mentioned, I have insurance and banking and everything in between. There's a group called the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which is every state has an insurance commissioner. I'm New York's. The other states and plus the territories all have insurance commissioners. We work through an association. They were working for years on a cybersecurity model law that had fits and starts, and we've now worked with them, and they're going to come out with a model law very soon that is almost identical to the New York regulation. There are some differences that just are related to insurance, but are not really germane for purposes of what we care about. So that's one way to at least make for consistency. I'm also working through on the banking side. There's something called the State Conference of Bank Supervisors because there's a banking commissioner in each state, and I'm that for New York as well. And I'm working with the other banking commissioners as well to spread the word. At my agency, DFS, we also supervise most of the foreign banks. Because most foreign banks have a branch in New York, so they get a license from my agency, and the Federal Reserve also has a role in that because of the funds. As I mentioned, the Bangladesh Bank was one, and so we're actually working with the Federal Reserve in our examination of the banks on their cybersecurity practices, just like we've been doing with respect to another regulation that I have, which is transaction monitoring, which has to do with sanctioned transactions, terrorist financing, other things that are also keeping me up at night. So back a little bit to Equifax, because I think, and I'm hoping that people are not getting dulled by it. But you had a lot of things. You have health insurance companies, data breached. You have banks, money going out. You have, and this was now bipartisan yesterday, finally, yes, Russia interfered with our election. So you have that. This is all cyber. And now you have Equifax. And you're saying, okay, now that's people and their credit. People, and I go to a bank to get a mortgage. I'm getting charged more on my insurance for a car because my credit score is too low. All of those things. And so now there's a highlight on this issue. And now there are hackers that have all that information. Credit card numbers, social security numbers, driver's license numbers. And what about my credit report? Is it accurate? Was it accurate before? Not sure. But now? And then you start, and 145 million, by the way, is 45% of the population of the United States. It's a lot of people. And a lot of it is unknown. It's frustrating. I'm sure you're all frustrated when you read in the papers. You're not getting clear answers. People are calling DFS all the time. What are we supposed to do? And I say, I assume that you're hacked. Think about putting a credit freeze. Think about credit monitoring. But as I've told the company, you cannot charge a single New Yorker for that because I'm not going to let you do that. But that's what you can't really do much else. You're not necessarily a victim of identity theft, but look at your credit report, get more credit reports. But what else can you really do about it? I hate to sort of say that, but that is a reality. But what we have to do is we really should think about the circumstance that led to this, which is an industry that fed on buying and selling data and didn't do anything to protect the data, or at least this company. I don't have any information about the others, so I'm not trying to tarnish anybody else. But that's what you have. They made lots of money. Their stock price was very high. Their executives were well paid by buying and selling data. That's the business that they were in and are in, and we really have to think about that. And the other thing I would say, it is largely an unregulated industry. What does that say? Right? Maybe it needs to be regulated. A lot of people in Washington that are talking about it. So I asked the question, what if Equifax had a regulator that required it to have enhanced cybersecurity protections? What if they actually kept the promises that they made? If you looked at their website, they were promising you protection of your data. But most of what they were doing was buying the data and getting the data and then selling it in all these credit reports and all these other things. And of course then, if you breached, you have credit monitoring and we're going to charge you for all those things. And then your employment data is also in another database. How many of these were hacked, we still don't know, but quite serious. So when this happened, we all got together, the team at DFS. And again, I have the law enforcement hat. So, fine, I could say, yes, I launched an investigation. Okay. I'm not going to sit on that and wait for the documents to come and go through the thing to figure out all the details of it. What do we do to prevent this from happening again? So we did three things. The first thing is I issued a regulation. Financial services law gives me the authority over financial products and services. My institutions have contractual arrangements with Equifax and other credit reporting agencies. So I'm protecting they don't even know they don't know what to do. Should they give data? Should they not give data? So I did a regulation. It's a proposed regulation. There's a 45-day comment period. That's the law. And it's an appropriate law because I have to get comments on it and make sure that we incorporate all good comments. And so what does the regulation say? Have to comply with the cybersecurity regulation. Okay? Is somebody going to fight that? I hope not. You have to have good cybersecurity protections from here on in if you want to do business in the state of New York. You have to register with DFS, and you have to satisfy certain basic things, not only cybersecurity, but you can't defraud or mislead a consumer. You can't engage in unfair, deceptive, or predatory acts or practices. You can't misrepresent or omit facts. And you have to, communicate with consumers accurately. So, and if you don't, then you may not be able to have the privilege of doing business in New York. I mean, that's just, and then people say to me, well, isn't that going to prevent people from doing business in New York? I'm like, you kidding me? There are 20 million people in the state of New York. We have the best financial industry in the world. We're the capital of finance. They'll do business in New York. And if the bad company who can't do the right thing doesn't do business in New York, fine. The good company will take their place and do the business well. That's my view. It's happened. It's not new. We have great business in New York. And, and we have protective laws. I say it all the time. We're the financial capital of the world and we're the progressive capital of the nation. You can protect consumers and you can be pro-business at the same time. New York is the place that is true and always has been. So that's my view of it. So that's where we're dealing with these credit reporting agencies. The other thing that I've done for those who are at banks or insurance companies is I also issued guidance to them. What do they do about the Equifax situation? They were actually asking for it. And so our guidance talked about installing security patches to address this, have these sort of ID theft and fraud prevention programs for your customer due diligence, because our banks have to do customer due diligence, know your customer requirements under law. And they need to, I said, you have to confirm information. You can't rely on the information you're getting from an agency that's been hacked because you don't know where that information is coming from. I asked the question, I don't have the answer yet, is that do we even need credit reports? Do we even need credit scores? I think it's worth a discussion of whether or not that's even needed anymore, and really how much institutions have to rely on those sorts of things in extending credit. You can get the information from the consumer. There's lots of touch points where you can find out information and decide whether or not to extend credit. And by the way, why should credit score matter in terms of how much you pay for auto insurance or something else? I mean, so there's some real legitimate questions as to whether this whole industry that's developed is something that's worthy of broader discussion. I wouldn't do that now because there's a lot of interrelated activity that's going on. So now it's just how do I deal with the current situation. Finally, but not any less important, is that we've done a consumer alert. Actually, we've had an identity theft brochure that we've sent around the state of New York for 2 years now. So before here, and we just did an alert to the consumers. And as I said before, there are things that you can get. You can get a credit freeze. You can get credit monitoring. You can get credit reports. Those are things out there already. And you have to be a little bit more vigilant. You have to, look at your credit reports to see if there's something there that's not you, and keep accurate records. Not a lot that I can say more on that. So a few more things. The Securities and Exchange Commission last week or 2 weeks ago announced another breach, which again, it's just goes without saying that we have, frankly, a real serious crisis on our hands with this. And that's why the most important thing, in my view, at least from where I sit, is for government to actually act, for government to set the rules of the road. And when people say to me, well, but you can't do that because then people can't keep up with technology and this is a fast paced thing, my regulation is not prescriptive. It doesn't say you have to do this particular product, this particular program. It's conceptual and it's risk based because every institution is different. And the institution has the obligation to do its own risk assessment and then to have adequate controls that address the risks that you identify in your risk assessment. Health insurance company has different risks than a bank has, than a check casher has, than a money transmitter has. And the risk assessment just has to evaluate that, and it has governance procedures to make sure the board of directors is involved in it, and it has training, and it has, positions that you have to have. You have to have a CISO, you have to have written policies, and you have to have the compliance certificate to make sure. And, people also ask me all the time, well, why can't you just do this by guidance? So, sometimes you just need to have teeth for people to actually do it. And that's just the essence of what sort of government, should do. And it needs to be done reasonably. I think we've done it reasonably. I actually think even our institutions will say that we did it reasonably in terms of, but, it's a process of getting people really on the same page. And that's really where I want to end, which is that this is an issue where we shouldn't be either in a competitive situation or where the regulator or government and the institution should be on different pages. It's an area that we really should have alignment because, frankly, an institution that suffers a significant breach is damaging its reputation for some time, maybe forever. And it also goes to the essence of that company that may not be around if the breach is that significant and people have choices to go elsewhere. And I think when you look at that, you really can't do a risk sort of reward type analysis or a cost benefit analysis, which is a phrase that I don't like. I mean, that's like the manufacturers of goods that, or of drugs, and there's a risk of, certain percent, so I'm going to take that risk because it's only going to cost me that much. With cybersecurity, whatever the cost is going to be significant, but the reward is that you're not going to breach and you're going to stay in business and you can have a good reputation. You could actually lead on it. And I think, the more that we talk about it without boring people, as I mentioned with the Bob and the Bach, I think the more that you put attention on it, those that are ahead of the curve on this will gain the positive reputation and the consumer protection, so long as, people are paying attention. I'm, again, happy to be here, happy to see all of you focusing so much on this really important issue. Happy to be able to say that, that New York, I think, is taking the lead on an important topic. I just recently did a piece in the American Banker about the Fearless Girl statue that is, down in Wall Street, staring down that bull. And yeah, there's got a gender component to it, so I talked a little bit about that. But just think about that, and I think on an issue like this, we have to be sort of fearless and stare down the bull, stare down everybody out there that wants to hurt the essence of our democracy, our financial institutions, people's personal information, and to just be not only ever vigilant, but keep talking about it, and those of you who have the ability to do something about it, because that's how change really happens, is when people all come together on a common purpose. And I think we'll get there. I just worry that there'll be more disastrous events before we all get there. So again, thank you for having me and for really coming together in a conference like this. If you have time, I'm happy to take questions or whatever, but thank you for having me. No, we got a question already. Okay. He's got the microphone, I think. I'm going to go with you, Peter. Okay.
Hi. Question. Reference to penalties for non-compliance of these rules, and secondly, Equifax doesn't fall under any of these categories as far as being regulated by the state?
So, when you say penalties for non-compliance, what do you mean? I mean, you're talking about general cybersecurity?
Like the ones that was put into effect on August 28th.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, again, I don't prefer to talk about penalties for non-compliance. I think penalties are important. I think teeth is important to get people to do the right thing, not to actually punish just for the sake of doing that. And but I have regulatory and supervisory and law enforcement authority over the banks and the insurance companies. So in the insurance law and the banking law and the financial services law, there are provisions that go as strong as people having a license revoked or suspended. There are financial penalties. There could be types of business that could be deauthorized if certain requirements are not met, and obviously all of that has to be, except in real extreme circumstances, after notice in a hearing. There's due process in all of this, as this should be. So I already have that in the law, and the financial services law gives me very broad regulatory authority to issue regulations over the institution. So it would just fall. But the cybersecurity reg itself, I didn't put in there. I think the sentence just says, have whatever authority I otherwise have, because I really am not focused on that, except that I expect people to comply. But to me, having a cybersecurity breach is not a good thing. Whatever money the state of New York may be able to recover, and I'm not looking for that. I'm just saying, it's not. It's really intended to prevent to shore up the industry's cybersecurity protections. And by the way, I think a lot of them are in a great place. And we're doing a lot already, but it's important to sound that alarm. Equifax, in New York, my regulation is now, because they provide financial services and products. Equifax has some federal regulators, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, under Dodd-Frank, gave some regulatory authority over credit reporting agencies, and the FTC has some authority over credit reporting agencies. That's on the federal side of things. I don't think that's supervisory authority. It's very different to be a supervisor than simply having laws applied to an agency. So as a supervisor of an insurance company or bank, as I am, we're in there, right? We look at their financials, we look at their market conduct, we look at their compliance with law on a regular basis. That's what a regulated industry is, not just laws applying to it. And I think that's maybe a piece that people need to think more carefully about with respect to these credit reporting agencies, to be distinguished from credit rating agencies, which is a whole nother, talk about the financial crisis and credit rating agencies, and that's still unregulated. And they came up at, that's not, everybody thought, a lot of people thought that those were government. It's not. It's just, business. And that's why I sort of say, why do we have all of this? It's some people got together and thought it was a good idea, but then I think it got a little out of control with the amount of personal data that people were buying and selling. So, that's, yep.
As part of your enforcement program, do you have cybersecurity examiners going into the field and examining companies?
So, yes.
Finish, Phil.
So that's supervision. Oh, the question was, I think the question was, as part of my enforcement portfolio, do I have cybersecurity examiners? That's really a, right. We have bank examiners, we have insurance examiners. We have had for a long time IT examiners who have examined our institutions for their IT. And those IT examiners have for some time been, become experts in cybersecurity. With our regulation that we came out with, so I'm glad you asked this question because I didn't mention it before, we've actually conducted training of all of our examiners. They're not all complete yet, but all of our examiners across the agency in cybersecurity and our reg, because there's a sort of a fundamental base examination question, just like in transaction monitoring or other compliance issues, or even some sort of complex audit or financial issues, where all of the examiners know what to look for, and then if they see something more complex, they sort of field it up. So we've actually created a structure of different levels on cybersecurity where people will have greater training. And some of this training, we're actually working with law enforcement on this. I mean, not just, real cops, law enforcement, DA, FBI type people, to help us with that training, sending people out to training things so that they can learn that. I also am hiring, was a public posting that I'm hiring more cybersecurity examiners. I'm hiring from within the agency people who want to dedicate themselves to that, because there are people that have expertise and they want to dedicate themselves, and also from the outside. And I got over 300 resumes for those positions, so which we're working through now and hiring. So anybody who knows any good people that are looking, hurry up and get your resume in. It is government, so it's not what you can make in the private sector, but you can do some real good if you're interested in working for government to help on that. So we are working on all that. Thank you for the question.
So I have two questions actually. In terms of your 72-hour breach requirements, do I have to report the breach if it's a forensics team come in and said there was a breach but nothing was stolen, we just kind of came in, looked around, and nothing happened? Or do I have to report all breaches regardless of the case? And the second question I have is, DFS has a lot of security controls that are asking for, but it's not exactly mapped to anything, unlike HIPAA, which is a direct mapping to NIST. And as you said, it's also based on a company's risk assessment and a CISO register. So a CISO could say, like a DLP solution, you know what, I don't need it, I don't want it, but is it a requirement, and where can we find these mappings?
So again, so your first question, our notice provision is not limited to successful breaches. It includes unsuccessful breaches. I don't have the language in front of me, but conceptually, because that's what we tried to get the language to, is conceptually, if someone enters and if they were successful, they would have had some material impact on the operations of the company, then you have to report that. Now, obviously, that includes some subjective judgment, to do that. We've gotten a lot of questions on this. People wanted us to limit it to successful breaches, and that, to me, you don't get lessons learned by just successful breaches. And part of what we intend to do is, if we hear from one entity that, so just say the Equifax situation, which it wasn't, or even some of these malware situations where there's an identification of a culprit and somebody learns of it, successfully, puts it out, and they know that it's coming from or it's a third-party vendor or something, then we can tell the other institutions in that same space, all confidentially, because I don't make this public, to say, beware of this. Do you use such and such? and be able to do it. So that's why unsuccessful is important as part of the notice provision. We have on our website FAQs, because we've gotten a lot of questions. And my approach to this has been that, we gather those questions, we publish our answers in FAQs, as opposed to only telling certain people some things and it being misunderstood. So a lot of those, questions are addressed in that way. If there are more, we will continue to, I think we're up to 25 or 30 FAQs already on our cyber reg. So thank you for the question.
I understand that you either license or charter roughly 3,900 institutions. One, is that close to the right number? And two, how does that compare to other states?
So the number. If you count mortgage, I think you have over 7,000 just there, because you got lots of brokers and individuals on that. In terms of, the numbers, insurance is probably more than 1,500. When you're dealing with banks and, including the federal branches, it's probably in the 300 and something. And then you have all these licensed lenders, which are a lot of small companies. You have all the money transmitters, you have the check cashers, so it's a lot. So it's more than the number you said, but it's in thousands. I think the total assets are over $7 trillion in assets in New York. Know that if you're an insurance company, you have to get a license. There's no federal regulation. There's no federal regulator. And so any insurance company that sells insurance to New Yorkers has to have a license. So it doesn't necessarily have to have its headquarters here, but they'll have, a company, or maybe not a company, but they're selling, and so they have to have a license and they have to comply with New York law as it comes to that. So that's all included. On the banking side, I don't regulate federally chartered banks. There's preemption of that. But I have all the money transmitters and all the licensed lenders, and I have a lot of community banks, and I have, because it's New York, I have most of the foreign banks because they have branches in New York. There are some that may have a branch in another state as well that has a license there, but pretty much the foreign branches because of New York. So we're a large part of the population of the country. We're a large part of the finance of the country, and on the insurance side, in terms of sales, we're probably 2 or 3. California and Texas are pretty high up there in sales of insurance. It's just population driven mostly. So.
Hi, I'm Cindy Cullen. I'm with the ISC Squared New Jersey chapter, and I agree 100% that people are feeling frustrated, and I think a lot of the frustration comes from lack of control over your data. So a few suggestions. We should have the right to be forgotten in any database whatsoever, including in the Equifax and credit history databases. The databases should have the ability, the default state should be frozen. It should be free. There should be the ability to have a credit check. You should be able to check your credit 24/7, 365. It shouldn't be that, and it should be free. Since it's your data, you should have access to it. And then also we should be able to track anybody who has had access to our data and why they are using it or how they are using it. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you. And
then
look, go ahead. It's obviously it's complicated because people have to get credit. You go to a bank, you go for a mortgage, and you're always signing pieces of paper, and one of those pieces of paper is basically giving consent to having your data go and for them to be able to get a credit report and all those kinds of things. And so what's needed to get to where you are is probably federal legislation that bans certain practices. And
Well,
I
and-
think, as I said before, I think we have to think very carefully about this because, and the same thing, and I know that this is a smaller piece of it, is when people say, well, should I freeze my credit? I say, well, if you freeze your credit, then you can't get credit. Right? So we have to think about the ramifications of, certainly in a interim time frame as we think about what's the right way to do this, what can be done to ensure that commerce for people, and I'm not sure that everybody would want their credit score frozen right now. What about the 20-year-old and the 21-year-old that doesn't have credit and is trying to build credit, unless we get it out of the system entirely, which I think creates a lot of thought as to what, if anything, should replace that. But, I agree with you conceptually. We should, and you should be able to access your, credit, your credit report. Right now, the law requires that you get annually a credit report. And I'll say on that, so you're entitled to a credit report annually from each of the 3 big agencies. So people should get one every 4 months from the different agency. So then you actually get 3 a year. Don't get them all from the same one. But, that's under the current law. Hopefully Congress will do something, but that's always a difficult challenge.
We don't have time for any more questions because there's another
Okay.
session starting in here at 4. Please send
Thank
your
you.
questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.